I'm Peter Perry, and today we're talking about authorship and pseudepigraphy. Pseudepigraphy is a big fancy word, try to say it 3 times fast, pseudepigraphy, 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 that simply means false writing. Although that's the literal meaning of the word pseudepigraphy, we want to distinguish and be more nuanced that this is used to describe a work that is written by someone who claims to be someone else. Let's take a closer look. The problem is that some of the letters that claim to be written by Paul were likely not written by Paul. It's possible that Paul wrote Colossians and Ephesians, but unlikely. It's unlikely that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, even though his name is on the front of it. And it's very unlikely that he wrote Titus or 1 and 2 Timothy. Let's look at some evidence. There's internal evidence that's content and theology that doesn't match Paul's undisputed letters. There's the structure, vocabulary, and style of these works that do not match the letters that we know Paul wrote. Among the letters that we call the undisputed letters, there is a consistency between these letters that has been shown using computers and statistics and analysis of structure and vocabulary, language and style. And there is also striking difference between these undisputed letters by Paul and with the letters that we're discussing now that we're calling disputed letters. Titus, 1st and 2nd Timothy are often called the pastoral epistles, and they are disputed, meaning it's very unlikely Paul himself wrote them. For example, take the word faith. In the letters of Paul that are considered undisputed, you can take the word trust and almost everywhere replace the word faith with trust, and the sentence makes sense. For example, Romans 3:22, the righteousness is given through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. You can replace the word faith with the word trust. This righteousness is given through trust in Jesus Christ to all who believe. But in the pastoral epistles, faith is equivalent to Christian doctrine and interchangeable with the word truth. So in 2 Timothy 3:8, just as Jannes and Jambres opposed Moses, so also these teachers oppose the truth. They are men of depraved minds who, as far as the faith is concerned, are rejected. Notice the faith, you can replace that with the truth, who, as far as the truth is concerned, are rejected. Another example, in the undisputed letters, Paul uses only the word Savior once. It's not a word that Paul uses. And the one time that Paul does use the word Savior, he uses it to refer to Jesus. In contrast, the pastoral epistles use it 10 times, sometimes referring to God separately from Jesus. For example, in 1 Timothy 1:1, he is Paul the apostle by the command of God our Savior and of Christ. Scholars have noted this difference and asked how Paul would have, for most of his writing career, written to so many different people, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, and then only once used the word Savior in Philippians, would all of a sudden start using the word Savior, and not just to refer to Jesus, but also to refer to God, assuming God the Father. Very strange, and so people have used this as evidence to suggest that it was not his hand that authored the pastoral epistles. For another example, Paul uses the word overseer and deacon in the undisputed letters only in the generic sense. For example, in Philippians 1:1, he greets them together with the overseers and deacons. But in the pastoral epistles, there are defined offices with qualifications and positions with status in the community. In fact, a big part of these letters is about the status of deacons and overseers, which is more similar to other documents later than the New Testament, such as the Didache, the letters of Ignatius, and 1 Clement. As we talk about other documents, we're beginning to move into external evidence outside the letters themselves. Here's another example, is that there's no record in Acts or Paul's letters of him ever visiting Crete, but Titus has him leaving Titus in Crete. This is the other kind of evidence that's used to make arguments about authorship, that there are other documents outside of the pastoral epistles and these letters that show similarity in church structure and theology. We can use quotations and discussion by later Christians as external evidence about the authorship of a work, and the historical setting, the chronology, the geography, and so forth. For example, in 2 Thessalonians, there's chronological problems. 2 Thessalonians implies that it closely follows 1 Thessalonians. The prescript, which puts Paul, Silas, and Timothy still together, makes it sound like 2 Thessalonians closely follows 1 Thessalonians. But this creates a problem because the man of lawlessness was most likely Nero, who committed suicide in 68, which some people feared would do something similar to Caligula. The Emperor Caligula was remembered for wanting to set up a statue in the temple in Jerusalem. And Josephus, when he writes his history both of the Jewish War and his Antiquity of the Jews, talks about how Caesar wanted to set this statue up and how it just sent faithful people, Jews and Christian Jews, into a frenzy of despair. And so when Nero came along the scene and wanted to set up statues of himself, they began to think that Caligula was reborn, a kind of setting up statues. And Nero set up a huge statue of himself in Rome, the Colossus Neronis, that was 120 feet high in what he called the Golden House. And so we can see how with Nero setting up statues to himself to be worshipped, how Christians could call him the man of lawlessness and would anticipate that he's going to do the same thing that Caligula had done. If this is true, then the chronology is very different, and 2 Thessalonians must be written much later, when it's not possible for Paul and Silas and Timothy to be together. Further distance between 1st and Thessalonians chronologically is indicated by the different ways of talking about Jesus coming. In 1 Thessalonians, the Lord is coming very soon. But 2 Thessalonians insists that the Lord is not coming until a later time, saying, "Don't let anyone deceive you in any way, for that day will not come until." Now there are some who use this evidence in order to dismiss these letters as not valuable, or that they should not be read by Christians today. And we need to assert strongly that these are still valuable to how followers of Paul address situations in their time, and how we can learn from how they followed Christ and followed Paul's teachings. And even more importantly, we need to resist the urge to fall into either-or thinking, that it's either Paul wrote it or he didn't, and he either did it or he lied, or we don't want to get into that. There is a range of ways to think about authorship in the ancient world, and we need to have this fully in our minds, that there are many ways to talk about authorship and pseudepigraphy. We need to talk about levels of authenticity. The first being the literal authorship, second, dictation, third, delegated authorship, fourth, posthumous authorship, fifth, apprentice authorship, sixth, honorable pseudepigraphy, and seventh, forgery. Let's go through each. First, literal authorship means that the church leader writes a letter in his own hand. And perhaps 2 Corinthians, Philippians, and 1 Thessalonians fall into this. For example, 2 Thessalonians and Philippians both have Paul and Timothy in the authorship position, and perhaps in 1 Thessalonians as well, that it was Paul's hand and only Paul's hand that wrote it, but perhaps not, because dictation was far more common. Dictation is when a church leader dictates a letter almost word for word to amanuensis. Most of Paul's letters, at least Romans, 1 Corinthians, Galatians, and Philemon, were dictated. The scribe who received the dictation is even named at the end of Romans. "I, Tertius, who wrote down this letter, greet you in the Lord." And many of Paul's letters have some kind of note written on the end in Paul's own hand. The only reason that Paul would write this kind of thing, "I write in my own hand," is because the handwriting is distinguished and the readers would notice it. So he shows that this is his own hand at the very end, authenticating the letter. But literal authorship and dictation are not the only two kinds of authorship used in the ancient world. There's also delegated authorship, where a church leader describes the basic content of an intended letter to a disciple or an amanuensis, and then that person writes the letter for the leader to approve and sign. Some scholars use this as an explanation for 2 Thessalonians and perhaps Colossians. Colossians begins, "Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother." And it's possible that Timothy actually wrote the letter, and then Paul put his greeting at the very end of it, in his own hand to show that he authenticates it. Similar to delegated authorship, posthumous authorship means that the church leader has died and the disciples finish a letter that the person had intended to write and sending it posthumously in his name. Some authors use this as an explanation for 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, and the pastorals, that Paul had outlined basic concepts to Timothy or Silas or one of his followers, who then fleshed it out in the letter using different language and sometimes different theology, and explaining the differences in style and content and the chronological problems, and then sending it off in Paul's name. Paul suggests at the end of 2 Timothy that he is nearing his death, saying that the time for my departure is near. And so it's perhaps possible that he had talked about these things, and this disciple then wrote these things down and sent them off to Timothy, or sent them to be used as a kind of circular letter in order to instruct other Christian leaders. Another scenario is that Paul could have been apprenticing someone to speak for him, and even while he was alive, that he had authorized Timothy and Silas to speak for him, and that person just continued to write in his name even after he died. This would be called apprentice authorship. Once again, this could be Silas or Timothy writing for Paul in 2 Thessalonians. This could be used to explain other changes in style and content and vocabulary. It could be Timothy who's writing Colossians. Another possibility is honorable pseudepigraphy, that the church leader dies and admirers who really seek to follow their influence and with the sincere belief they are responsible bearers of his tradition write in his name. Some scholars use this as an explanation for 2 Thessalonians, Colossians, Ephesians, and the pastorals, and it is the most often used to explain 2 Peter. The idea is that the person is honorable. Yes, they are writing in Paul or Peter's name, but they are trying as best as they can to follow in the tradition, and they don't mean any disrespect and in any way to deceive people as they write in their name. But if the first 6, from literal authorship down to honorable pseudepigraphy, are all writings that we as Christians then should listen to and to try to learn from, there is forgery, where the church leader has obtained sufficient prominence that either before or even after his death, people try to exploit that legacy by forging letters in his name and presenting themselves as a support of their own ideas. This is obviously going on in 2 Thessalonians. So whoever wrote 2 Thessalonians is identifying that there are people trying to write, perhaps in Paul's name, allegedly from us, he says, by prophecy or by word of mouth or by letter, and that these forgeries in Paul's name are attempting to deceive the Thessalonians. And it's possible that someone took up Paul's pen in order to refute how someone else was using Paul's name. So now what? What do we do with this information? If you're among the many who, when they listen closely to the text, discover that there are these really striking differences between certain letters of Paul and others, and follow the evidence and discover that it's unlikely that Paul wrote, for example, the pastorals, it can be very distressing for some. And we want to acknowledge that that is not an uncommon place, but we can grow through this, and most importantly, the goal is to listen closely. The reason that scholars have concluded that Paul most likely did not write some of these letters is because they listened closely to the author, audience, situation, purpose, and Jesus, and compared them. And we need to continue to do that too, and engage the evidence. We should not take these conclusions without examining the evidence quite carefully. And we should feel free to disagree with the conclusions that some scholars have made, but we need to be able to present evidence to back up our claims and to analyze the evidence that's presented for claims. Further, we need to ask, even if Paul didn't write some of these letters, what's the situation that these Christian leaders were addressing through this letter, and how does it help us in our situations? We need to ask, why would somebody do this? And the answer, I think, is provided by rhetorical theory. We need to think ethos. If you think about ethos, how does Paul as the author help persuade the audience? And what does this say using Paul's name, what does this say about the audience, the situation, and Paul's reputation for this particular audience? And finally, we need to be thinking about Jesus with all this. How does this analysis of authorship and pseudepigraphy lead us to trust God's saving work in Jesus? How does it help us to turn away perhaps even from our own assumptions and trust in our assumptions in order to trust Jesus more? This week, we're going to be making a post on this subject, and I encourage you to engage in a lively conversation about authorship and pseudepigraphy. Thank you, and God bless you.